Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us online for a celebration and conversation with Kazim Ali, Sheila Chandra, and Rajiv Mohabir. My name is Lily Philpott, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual event space. For those of you who are new to the Asian American Writers Workshop, we are a nonprofit organization dedicated to uplifting Asian diasporic literature and storytelling. At a time when these communities are specifically vulnerable, we continue to offer a public and virtual space in which we can imagine a more just future. You can visit aaww.org for more information about our work. During this event, we ask that all audience members practice nonviolence in the chat. Comments that are racist, transphobic, homophobic, ableist, and/or misogynist will be flagged, and the person will be removed from this event. This evening, we will begin with a reading from Kazim's new collection, The Voice of Sheila Chandra. And then Kazim will be joined by Rajiv and Sheila for a conversation. We will have time for audience questions at the end of the night, and you can leave questions in the chat throughout. Books are for sale thanks to our friends at Books Are Magic. You can find a link to purchase in the chat, and you can support an independent bookstore in doing so. I am going to read Kazim, Sheila, and Rajiv's bios, and then I hope you will join me in welcoming Kazim on screen to read. Kazim Ali's books encompass multiple genres, including volumes of poetry Skyward, winner of the Ohio Anna Book Award in Poetry, The Far Mosque, winner of Alice James Books' New England, New York Award, and the cross-genre texts Bright Felon and Wind Instrument. His novels include The Secret Room, a string quartet, and among his books of essays are the hybrid memoir Silver Road, Essays, Maps, and Calligraphies, and Fasting for Ramadan, Notes from a Spiritual Practice. He is also an accomplished translator and an editor of several anthologies and books of criticism. His newest book is a volume of 3 long poems entitled The Voice of Sheila Chandra. Sheila Chandra made some of the most beautiful and innovative recordings in the world music category, beginning with her band Monsoon's 1982 hit, Ever So Lonely, until voice problems forced her to retire in 2010. Since then, she has gone on to become a best-selling nonfiction author, and she also began mentoring the then-homeless street artist Stick in 2008, who has gone on to become one of the most famous and collectible street artists in the world. Rajiv Mohabir is the author of The Cowherd's Son, winner of the 2015 Kundiman Prize, and The Taxidermist's Cut, winner of the Four Way Books Intro to Poetry Prize, finalist for the Lambda Literary Award for Gay Poetry in 2017. He is also the translator of I Even Regret Night, Holy Songs of Demerara, which received a Penn Haim Translation Fund grant. His memoir won the 2019 Restless Books New Immigrant Writing Prize and is forthcoming in 2021. Thank you again for being here, and please join me in welcoming Kazim.
Hello, everyone. It's so good to be with all of you here today from around the country and around the world. I am sitting here in San Diego, California, which is located on the traditional lands of the Kumeyaay people. I'm going to read from the title poem. This book is 3 long poems, which makes it challenging to read from. And I'm going to read from the central poem, which is the title poem. It's a sequence of 40 unbuckled sonnets. And so I'm going to read a selection from those sonnets that were very much inspired by Sheila Chandra's music and her voice. The Voice of Sheila Chandra. Breaks is constant, was like the river, light on the river, riven that remained a rift, an old rill that sounded, she merged with the vibe, ration of the drum, a hum, a home womb, and she, moaned in the loam, dark earth, come, Sheila, dame, ocean, dome this poem, roam to tome, tomb, foam, original fountain that fed my mom, Zamzam, when I was born. Who can, in syllables, like Sheila Chandra moan, us covered in a blanket of sound, this like cloud bank of stars keeping us from eternity, which under the blanket seen, like Sanjay, a dancer who I guess I somehow look like, was mistook for once, 3 times in one day, 20 years ago, but the story still resounds. Some woman at a festival saw him perform, swore I was he. I said I wasn't. She did not believe. Me, a brass bowl, soul, swindle through years, no identity theft. I want to move like that off the axis of the spine into where and where Sanjay said, I am not him. And what does all this have to do with the voice of Sheila Chandra? She having lost, having now no longer, sound now a constant striking into chaos. That note that flickers through in abstraction, one is one or zero, and confused, the ear does not focus, neither opens nor closes, always is. Long before she lost it, drifts unanchored, wanted to merge, and the body of the singer become the body of the instrument. Talk to the drum, find it, hum, study its vowels. She made her vow to sound, slowly, syllable by syllable she pronounced words in Uzbek, word unmoored, word pure sound. Oh, river, long had I been, long seasons invaded by your current, devoured your tongue of water, those years time bent, my one voice spoke. Carried cacophony, world wheel into the human, one small voice. Box, pool, swam midnight, we went into the sea, expecting our prayers might carry themselves across the silver slammed surface, would be answered, or do they answer? Pale cut of prayers, do not answer, like back into the dark water. What are those stripes of light across the room, a shape that evaporates? Upon waking, what language cannot hold on to, what you cannot hold on to? How to transcribe what flickers, what is not fixed, that voice, letters made not of ink, but light, not words of fire on stone. How do you transcribe the blank vowel, all the after that aerates, not disappear, but settle down through air? You do not want to say, but sing. Where might be rain, be sky come down by snow, but no, you invite it to cover you, the blanket, your coat, a heavy pressure. God, pressure of rain. You want to start the song over, but do not dare to be ready. No tune, no cadence, nothing to pick up, no bridge to cross, now to be small again, break through. There is no beginning to any song, only the place the singer picks up the tune. Music spent my breath to achieve or invent death, each chord or cadence out of reach, out of tune. Last time in this town, I promised vow or vowel to turn my back forever on chaos and give myself instead to music, organizing itself in my ear from chaos, a river made rather than music that makes a shape of endless seconds. I devoted myself to the equation of numbers, between each sound a formula that matches planets and atoms. Music is not an art, but science. I could have remained alive, but I broke. Sheila Chandra sings without words because maybe a word is a form of rage against death, the implicit formlessness of the body, which translates as the soul does not cohere. Every feeling of a body as mortal means separately French, mot and mort. What do we know and can't tell of the deep black of the world, of death, of the painting on the wall? I, in past days, trusted border zones, relinquished homes, sounds, let the nothing storm in. Was that painting a sculpture or a recess? The painting was in this color that is a newly developed color called Vanta Black. And it's too dark to see. Your eye can't see it. That's how dark it is. Vanta Black was made for missiles or planes for defense purposes so dark, no eye could see it. Some voices are like that. No one could hear them. It is not good to be lost. To be lost is more than metaphor for spiritual condition. I sit at the terrace overlooking the green sea. Perhaps it is failure that ought to be sought. The voice that fails falls silent, Sheila's, or the bodies. The blue failed me, the sun fails every evening. I, we, you have all failed too. Everyone who strove all these long years for peace failed. Sheila Chandra has been rendered mute, the ambassador of sound. Gray clouds compromise the day, auctioned off, siphoned off, betrayed by the failure of nerve endings and science. No cure for burning mouth syndrome. She sang in Uzbek, contorted her tongue around words she never knew, learned. Even the language of the drum, away from melody, there is only harmony in the outer districts of the city of sound, ordinary spaces, empty bandstand, atonal landscape, the sea's surface in the morning before the day's traffics its contours. In a world governed by storm and noise, why then should a singer not fall silent, though by great suffering? Her mouth, that orchestra hall aflame, the drone, her most minuscule movement, still do the echoes resound. Even now, can I discern them? Anish Kapoor explores the place. Sight disappears, rich, dark, that opens. He makes shapes of them, invites you to understand, fails. Agnes Martin, her shapes of white absence, both what, when the throat fails, sounds out. Does Sheila still listen to music? What does it sound like? Can she still feel music in her body? Can she vocalize even without technology of the mouth, tongue, palate, glottis, vocal cords? What is a voice? Anish Kapoor granted exclusive right to work with Vanta Black. She, Sheila, now communicates through notes and gesture. Vanta Black, made for military purposes, like sound, also used for torture. All sounds to wake you, vibrate your brain. What emerges as an echo from music as torture. Children on the beach playing God is sound or art or science. Shit and sex. The body's echo. What mess is left in the big or the little death. And I'll just do a couple more to close. Actually, three more to close. One more than a couple. Calligraphy is a meeting point between abstract and particular by certain combinations of visual marks to make symbols. Sheila Chandra lost her voice around the same time I found mine at midnight. We went to swim in the sea so we could be in the dark and not know the bottom, but the moon lit up the surface so silver, so slammed. And then the boy, with the fear of failure, falling, architecture, voice, God, depths, death, he swam. Oh, in the house of Sheila Chandra, silence do not reign. Sheila Chandra's voice that swells, of sun I am one, what word that quells? The chords in the box, the mouth, throat, third voice sought. Do not reign and rain my hands, hand me the rain, will you sing, can you swing your votes, vox, fox? In the Hausa I learned scripture, stripped her in the roost, roused all the birds to the blue, the moon, sun, singer, singes, now the world sound, some echo, wind, echo, wing. Who can born then believe, beleaguered, besieged, be seen, leagues from where you started, parted in league with my leash. Legions of sound, sounder her then believed, darkest black. And be unseen, a voice tracks back from frown, fawn, founded, fundament firmly, this firmament. This fund of sound born where you are, I did not want to be found. How can you say that? How can you now know what foe? No, she sang out, flow. She breathed and be real, eve and low. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kazim, for that wonderful reading. It's been so nice to be sitting with your words in this collection, this beautiful collection, The Voice of Sheila Chandra, and to be sitting with the sounds and having them be in my head, as well as now to hear you read them aloud for us has been quite a treat. I think I want to ask my first question as a kind of lead-in general question before I get into the kind of bone or nitty-gritty that I think that you're familiar with, of like my asking you. But I'd like to know a little bit about the poem of The Voice of Sheila Chandra, and how did it come to you? Like, was it sound by sound or sonnet by sonnet?
You know, thank you so much for asking that. First of all, Sheila Chandra's music has been just a huge part of my creative life for 20 years probably. So I was late to the party actually, but I moved north of New York City just 10 days before September 11th, 2001. And so I was living in this tiny little village town, far away from a place I thought of as home, when this sort of seismic thing was happening. And the war and the anti-war movement and the Hudson Valley, like it was a very dramatic time. And this was in the day of music shops where you would go in and thumb through CDs, or not even records, and I found a CD of hers, and it was Sheila Chandra and the Ganges Orchestra. This sentence is true, the previous sentence is false, or something. I might be getting the title wrong, but the title was a negation. And it was drones, and it was conical, and it was vocalization. It was just incredible. And so something about, I could talk about this for an hour, so I'm gonna wrap up really quickly because I know that we want to talk about a lot, but there was something about the texture of the voice, in particular the drones that layered notes on top of notes, the assuming of the voice of the drum in the human. It was just, there was something incredibly powerful about it that seemed to be a lot about what I wanted a poem to be. To give you an example, I was also reading at the same time Ted Berrigan's sonnets, which are extremely polyvocal and they interrupt themselves. They're sonnets, but they don't build like a rhetoric of a sonnet. And so as you can see, the sonnets that I wrote traffic in Berrigan's structure of the sonnet. But what had happened was I was in Cassis in the summer of 2016. This was before the election of Donald Trump. And so there was a lot of despair in the air, which I think you can hear in the poems, this sort of everyone who strove for all these long years for peace has failed. It's very dramatic, you know? And I was writing other poems. I was not writing this poem, I was writing the other poems that make up the book. And every morning I was waking up before dawn and writing in a journal, free writing and listening to the drones. It wasn't months later, this was June, it wasn't until November when I was in Chicago that I started to try to copy out those notes, and that's when they started to shape themselves into sonnets. They led me to that form.
Wow.
So I don't know how to talk about like at the Voice of Sheila Chandra is her actual voice gave me the form for those poems, you know?
Yeah, that's so amazing to think of, and compelling, you know, the drone form, the layering of notes on notes, the kind of like palimpsest of histories that you're living through, especially given, and I wonder about that, you know, in terms of the form. I think you called these sonnets unbuckled sonnets. And I wanted to know a little bit, and I wanted to hear you talk a little bit more about, I know that on social media you've talked about wildness in poetry, and I'm so intrigued by this, and the relationship between the wildness that is in your poems and how to moor that into like the formal poem. And this is a question that I think will be productive for a lot of folks that are listening, and I'm taking notes myself, so.
I mean, I think this is like the big curse of my literary life is that I am so excited by poems in which the reader is lost. I am so excited by poems of abstraction and dizziness and ecstasy and gesture. And in a music without words, one finds that, one feels that. And in a music that vibrates, of course, in yoga practice, and we'll probably talk about this later, and I hope we will when Sheila joins us, but the sound that vibrates in the cavities of the body, in the spine, that originates from the pelvis and travels up and resonates in the various different spaces that we have, including in our, in our skulls, that the body itself is a resonant instrument. It's so joyful for me to write poems that are grounded in that sense of echo and sense of return, rather than a poem in and of itself that begins and ends and has a structure and a rhetoric and a theme, but just a whole series of poems that is just a tremendous echo chamber of music. And I think when I listen to the drones, Sheila's drones, it's kind of like that. You live inside this sound, which oftentimes it's one single note, but of course, if you know music, it's every note has all of the other notes inside of it. There's this sense of the infinite in the particular. Yeah, so I don't know if that answers the question a little bit, but.
I like this, the infinite in the particular. I think that's a phrase that I'm going to, when I'm talking about this.
And infinite time in the particular instant as well.
And, I think like hearing you talk also about how that energy is travels through your body, you draw it up from your spine. I can't help but also think about, what you're talking about, how sound and poetry being completely moored to spirit. And then also like How, for you as poet, as conduit, is the spirit routed and mapped through the body? You know, as we see the containers of song through the Voice of Sheila Chandra, that poem specifically, but also through the entire collection, we see a kind of falling away of self, or a falling into the music of the line.
Yeah, it is a very much like I'm looking for this one poem that I wanted to quote for you from, because I thought it was a really interesting thing that happened, but I'm not sure I'll be able to find it. But I think that, of course, for me, and this is also drawn from my yoga practice as well, I think in Western modalities of the spirit and the body are very disconnected from each other. In fact, in some traditions, the body is considered an unclean thing that one has to transcend. And there is like various practices of cleansing or purification, that the body is base and you know, has to be purified or cleansed in some way, that there's a pollution. And I very much, with my whole being, don't believe that. You know, I think that every part of the body is sacred, and some of our most intimate moments physically are spiritual moments too. And I talk here about something about, I can't find the actual quote to read you, but at some point in this book, I say, when one loses oneself in in music or sex or the moment of shitting, that's the quote. And somebody quoted this in a review or on Twitter or something, I don't remember, and they cut of shitting. The quote was, when you lose yourself in music or sex or the moment, end quote. And I think that's what we're comfortable with. That's sort of like, you know, the notion of like a bodily function is dirty, you know, instead of one of the ways that we access what's most divine in the human. And that those two things are really, really related to each other, or feed one another, or move back and forth between those states. So the body is an instrument, in other words. I mean, in Hatha yoga practice, that's legitimately the root of the spiritual practice, is that, okay, you live in this mortal body that ages and sickens and dies and does all of those things that a body does. So you're supposed to use it to learn what the spirit is. And I mean, there's still language in those, even in those yoga texts, about transcending, like we have to transcend this shape in order to achieve union or whatever. So it's still, you know, confusing to me in a way, because I think our current mortal conditions, exactly as they are, with all of those things that are considered undignified or ruinous or, you know, polluting, that is all of what is divine.
Wow. Yeah, like literally routed through the body, like the shitting, the things that are like we are taught to shame, and all of these things, or like that don't belong in the space of poetry. But what I love about it is that it, you know, through sound, it seems to be some kind of like purifying act of naming the thing that I noticed in your poetry. But we're bringing Sheila on in like about a minute. But if you have a minute, could you just talk specifically, and this is like nuts and bolts kind of thing, can you talk about the joy of, you know, you were expressing that kind of joy of the poems? If you could actually show us an exact kind of moment that was like, oh, this is how I know as a poet, as a writer, that I have done the thing where the poem has traveled through me and onto the page.
I mean, when I was lost, so I told you I wrote these poems in the twilight, crepuscular morning of the northern Mediterranean in June, and then I traveled across the world. I was in Chicago. I was working as a caregiver for somebody who required, live-in care, and I was doing that all day long. And then at night I was just wandering the streets, you know, because my entire existence was focused on this other person. And I sat there with this notebook, and it was like France, June, warm sun, Chicago, November, the wind, you know, how cold it was, how lonely I felt. And to then be writing these poems, it really felt, and the transmutation that happened in myself, and the stranger they were, the farther away, the less I understood them, even me myself as the writer writing them, I felt like, I don't know, that a real thing was happening.
Wow, thank you. Thank you. And that's such a private question, or a question that I've asked you, of like such like interiority and like your own like inner life. And thank you so much for being so generous and like letting us know about this particular joy.
Yeah.
Let's see. Okay, I think Sheila Chandra. Sheila Chandra, hi, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so honored to be here with you.
Oh, not at all. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we, Kazim and I, as you were hearing, we're talking a little bit about, you know, the architecture of the book and how how your music was so incredible in terms of a catalyst for Kazim's work. And I was just
lovely to hear, because I didn't know those stories, so that was great to know the specifics of how all those things came through and transmuted.
Yeah.
Well, that is one of the things that touched me the most too, because though all those years ago you had to stop singing, and for a while I didn't realize that you were able, that you were able to speak a little bit, but I was affected so deeply by the concept of the echo, that the music, of course the tech of the music exists and it's there, someone can listen to it, but more spiritually, the notion of the echo of those pieces that you sang, and then how they resounded for me so much all of those years later and still now,
Oh, that's lovely.
Yeah. And like Kazim just told us how he came into your music. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how did music find you, Sheila?
For me, I think it was really, in the first instance, I don't think I can take any credit for it. It was biology. I was one of those annoying kids who wouldn't shut up, who knew every jingle on the TV and the radio, and would sing all day long. I mean, I'm talking singing "Please Release Me" by Engelbert Humperdinck all the way through with all the words when I was 3, and no one had taught them to me. I just had that kind of brain, and I think the brain is where you start, because as a child, your instrument is not fully grown. I mean, your instrument is not really fully grown until you're 25. What happens during adolescence for both men and women is that the voice box becomes very much more connected viscerally to emotions. So I was lucky. I had a very musical brain, and then when I was I think 14, my voice broke. I didn't get that sort of break thing that boys get, but my voice was suddenly, instantly connected to my emotions. Yeah, I think music found me because biologically I was kind of primed for it. And then I became obsessed with voice and obsessed with refining what my voice could do, and building on its skills.
Thank you for that. I love what you just said about the voice box being intimately connected to the emotions. It's so powerful to think about, right? Like what it is about the sound, like the utterance of the human, that just is profoundly resonant. And that's actually like, what joy in my life to have you both in my my office right now, in my apartment in Malden, Massachusetts. I see a direct kind of relationship between, like, Joy Harjo, the poet and nonfiction writer, the poet laureate of the States, refers to music as poetry's ancestor, and like literally we're seeing that here. And definitely in South Asian traditions, there's also kind of like this magic and sacred element that informs that connection, like, whether it's spirit or deity being connected to sound or utterance. And I was just wondering, with that space of between song and poetry, lyric or human utterance, what is the relationship in both of your estimations between song and poem? I mean, this is to be just a fun little thing to kick about.
Well, I mean, I think for me, that is precisely what I love the most in poetry, which is the music, and I kind of want more of it. And so you heard a little bit in the poems that I read today that I was I would often riff on sound. And that technique to me actually comes from the ghazal singers who will often take, like a single line and just sing it out for however long. Um, and I just love that. And so for Sheila, I'm curious because, of course, in some of your pieces, you do this too, where the song is really just one line, or it's Om Shanti Om or something like that. So I kind of wonder how you work with the sentence into the music, but also the question that lurks behind that question is, you did kind of move to singing words into just singing drones. And so I kind of wonder why. I mean, there was some thinking behind that, or if it was just an instinct, and then how did that feel to kind of leave words behind, I guess, and just move into pure sound?
Well, again, we come back to biology, because the interesting thing about puberty and when your voice box becomes affected by your emotions, what we're talking about there is literally, if you're excited, the adrenaline floods into the capillaries surrounding your vocal cords and affects the timbre of the sound. And similarly, if you're choked up, we all know that feeling of trying to get words out when the voice box is dropping into a sob. And the interesting thing about voice or vocalization without words, whether it's musical or not, is that you can't lie. You cannot lie about the emotional state you're in. And so we use words to lie. And of course, music can be very profound when we make a very deliberate decision to be open and real and visceral, and then we use the melodic vocalization or the sound behind that to emphasize the honesty of it. But it's also equally dramatic to use a lyric that deliberately lies and sing it with a completely different emotional undertone. So those are the sorts of things I was playing with the lyrics, but I think it was partly confidence moving into an expression beyond words and seeing how well I could convey the meaning of the song, or the meaning, the emotional expression, or the sound pictures that I wanted to inspire in the listener. And I really like the way that you riff on sound in the same way that you love the abstract. I think in a way you're moving, as far as poetry can, you're moving towards drone in the sense of that abstract use of sound as an evocative tool that doesn't necessarily at the first listening have to strike the listener with sense or a story or a narrative or whatever. And yeah, I can see when, the minute you said, oh, the first album you heard was This Sentence Is True, I start, oh yeah, now I really get it. I really get where that connection is, because I can totally see it in the way that you've written. But for me, reading poetry is actually quite difficult, because we always have the meter of the melody to tell us where to put the emphasis, and we always have the vowels as a guiding point as to where to leap off into vocalization. So when I read poetry, which is for me just like reading a lyric where I don't know the melody and I don't know the meter and I don't know the rhythm at all, actually hearing you read those stanzas, just suddenly that brought it to life for me, because it's kind of like taking away one of my senses that I rely on all the time to judge sound and its meaning, because it's always within that structure, even if the structure is as simple as a drone and a very, very basic one-on-one beat, even without a time cycle. So yeah, I can see where all those things are melding in what you're doing.
Thank you.
Yeah, wow. Thank you so much for this. I really love that, what you're saying about not being able to lie about your emotional state, and just the kind of like inherent irony there, just so incredibly moving. I can't wait to go back and re-listen to this album with this in mind in terms of like the sound. And in some ways it sounds like, with the sound pictures that you're talking about, and the difference between reading poetry and then being a reader of melody, it's just all these wonderful things to think about in terms of the building blocks. But Kazim asks a question in a poem about, gosh, I wrote it down, but I kind of refer to it again. Does Sheila still listen to music? And when listening to music, what do you hear? Because what you've been talking about has been so much about production of music, also from the human voice. How does it come to you? How do you channel it through kind of like your mind, your ears, your body? And then he says in the poem, and this is the poem I think, Kazim, that you were referring to earlier. You say Sheila's voice always in the background, always disappearing into music of what surrounds it, the way one loses oneself in sex or death, or the moment of shitting. So I guess that would be my question. What do you hear, and how does that organize for you in your mind?
Well, I don't listen to music very much. I certainly don't listen to a lot of new music. And part of the reason is that the voice box moves sympathetically with the sounds it hears. So ostensibly, I mean, we know, you've mentioned, Kazim, that I have a limited amount of time to talk, and then it will take me a few days to recover from the pain that provokes. And you would think that when either of you are speaking that my voice is resting, but actually my voice is making tiny micro movements in sympathy with your sound. So if I go to a concert or I go to a club that's very loud, I can expect to feel vocally tired even if I haven't said anything or sung anything. And also I find listening to music very emotionally painful, because I have an instinct to mimic and I can't do it. And I developed my technique as a teenager by just mimicking every pop and soul vocal that I could hear. Indian classical music wasn't particularly accessible to me until I was 16 or 17. So all the singers that you might think of, Chaka Khan, or I can't even remember who are you still, Barbara Streisand or whoever, even though I don't really have that kind of voice. So it's very hard for me to hear a song I like and not sing it. So I don't actually listen to music very much anymore, which is a shame, because it's such a source of joy. On the odd occasion I'll manage it, but I've got to be very disciplined about it.
Wow. I think that, if I could just add something, Rajiv, that is really powerful for me to hear. The notion that listening is as participatory as the singing or the vocalizing itself. And that was, that question was not to be too personal about it, but it was a self-questioning about grief, about the grief of a creative person who is separated from what their expression is, and I think that is really profound, and it is an actual condition here in terms of what you have had to, I don't want to get too personal, but what you have had to give up or what you don't have access to anymore, and yet this tremendous accomplishment that still exists in the world, as I talked about. And in the chat, there are people who, you're getting like some fangirl love in the chat. I mean, your artistic body of work is just beyond measure, it's tremendous. And so that still exists. And one just dreams of some medical breakthrough, you know what I mean? Like, it just.
Yeah, I do. And yeah. And I think on an artistic I think there are two levels. On an artistic level, of course, it is a huge source of grief, because I think about what I might be working on now had I not had, because I had some of the restrictions from about 92 onwards. So although I managed to keep working, I couldn't do as much of the exploratory vocal stuff, because I would have to write on my voice. Obviously, you can't write those sounds on an instrument and then transfer them to voice. So I think about where I might be as a musician now. And then there's the grief of knowing that you've got this instrument which has a small physical flaw, because I have a slight twist in my larynx from scarring from an emergency operation I had to save my sight in 92, which is when my problem started. And that kind of primed my system for pain. And then I developed this neurological pain in the mouth, which is burning mouth syndrome. So there is a sense that there is this instrument physically here, which I am sort of letting rot, like, you know, a violin in a damp cupboard, because I don't have the wherewithal to stand the pain of warming up and keeping it in tune and keeping the muscles tuned. And it's sort of, I mean, it's obvious if you were a dancer or something, if you don't keep those muscles trained, then they just can't do what the brain expects them to be able to do from memory. So there's this ghost of a memory and a kind of physical, visceral memory as to how to use the muscles and how to position the larynx to make a certain sound. And this is what happens when I play a very familiar song that I used to sing along to. My body gets into the position, but the musculature is not there. And the warm-up is not there. And the tone in my vocal cords is not there. So on a professional level, that's the grief. On a personal level, yeah, and it feels like I was born to be a singer, and I can't. And on a personal level also, losing one's ability to connect with people by speaking, particularly in sort of sociable environments, is an even bigger loss. I mean, there are some days when I think, yeah, well, it's all very, you know, it's all very well saying, yeah, you've lost this instrument, but I mean, if I had the choice of getting one element of my voice back, actually would be my speaking voice, because that limits me in so many ways. And we don't think about it, but we judge people by their speaking voices, by their accent, by the depth of the vocabulary, by the speed of their speech, by the amount they hesitate, by the truth that comes through in the tone of their voice. There's that as well in the speaking voice. And people are completely nonplussed if they've never heard you speak and all you've ever done is write notes for them or type for them. They just can't get a handle on you, and it weirds them out. And so it is quite difficult the voice is central to reaching people on a visceral and emotional level. So yeah, I mean, there's those two elements going on.
Thank you so much for this, and thank you also for being here and talking with us today. This is such a gift, truly, for me. Definitely.
My pleasure.
No, for Kazim. We have a couple minutes left. I have a question for you, but I think that probably the more interesting thing that everyone would want to hear is, Kazim, what question would you have for Sheila now?
I think that what I would really like to know, if I had one question to ask Sheila, I mean, the very act of conserving your voice and kind of selecting, you know, how long you can speak for, and you know, what you will say with that time, because I understand that you want to speak every day so that you can keep your voice able to be used. That is something. And so it's sort of like, well, what do you choose? You know, is it a phone conversation with this person, or if it's expression of love to that person? And that to me seems like the same constraint that accompanies the poet in terms of writing a poem. But it's like your daily vocal expression, it can't be you know, you talked about using the voice to lie, but I mean, you have to, if you need to be angry with somebody, you have to really make a decision, strategic decision about like, okay, I've got to utilize this amount of resources to express my displeasure. I'm kind of curious to know what your decisions are like when you're, you know, figuring out what's available to you and not.
It's difficult, and I don't think that there's a right answer. And I think even a decade after being constrained this much, you're right. I do need to speak sometimes. I usually speak about twice a week, in order to make sure that my musculature doesn't completely atrophy, so that I am not rusty when I speak. But I do have to ration it, and I used to think that it was only the big meaningful things that needed to be said, and that I should save it for being angry or being in love or being for expressing something profound, certainly for connection with people. Then I started to understand how much small talk is connection with other people, and how you can't just go for the jugular in terms of and that's where it does differ from poetry, because the mundane and the small talk, and sometimes just keeping the connection going between two people who are getting ready for a night out. If I've decided to expend that amount of vocal time, I used to sort of think, well, like, save it for the event itself. But if I'm getting ready with someone and then I don't speak to them for an hour and then we head out together, the connection has been completely broken, and the evening is ruined. So human beings are, you know, surprisingly, they connect as much through the mundane as they do through the big stuff. That's what I've found about the constraint of it. I think when you're a poet, I should imagine the advantages that people come to you in a listening state of mind, and they come to you, they come to the page expecting to think about truths and think about sound and think about the deeper things. So real life isn't always like that.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think it's time now for questions from the audience. Sheila, I think what this means is we're going to give you a chance to, you know, turn your camera and your microphone off so that we can field these questions from the audience. So thank you so much for being here again.
I have great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Sheila, before you go, I just wanted to tell you again, I mean, I don't even know how to express it. I love you. Thank you so much for, I mean, everything in the world. You've been a part of my life for, you know, 20 years. You've been a part of my life, and just to lay eyes on you and to talk with you and to be able to thank you for your work, it's really,
well, do you know what?
I am speechless.
When you're reading those stanzas, I was thinking, wow, he's got really into the interior experience of me creating that music. And I didn't realize that much could be communicated. I mean, it doesn't feel too exposed or vulnerable for me, because I'm happy for that to be communicated. But there is always the level of the intent of a song or the intent of a vocal effect, and then someone understanding the experience of the artist creating beneath that. And you know, got that in so many specific vignette instances within what you were saying. So there was I felt a real kindred connection there. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think that, you know, we should get those words and like, you know, definitely attach them to your book in some way. Being recorded so we can go back. Sheila, with your blessing, of course.
I'm back. I'm okay. I'm fine.
Amazing. And I think we have time for questions from the audience. So if you would please type them in the chat, and they'll be filtered to us, and we'll be able to ask Kazim these questions. While we're waiting, there was a question. Oh, here we go. A first question from Milagros Villa Plana. There's a mysterious ambience, questions, darkness, metaphysics, and art, to name a few elements in this masterful epic poem. Is the unbuckling of sonnets, sound, imagery, and words meant at some level to explore the unbearable suffering of losing a gift, as in Sheila Chandra's voice?
Well, I want to say thank you for that question, and it's very large, and I can only think about, I want to address a part of it, which is that in general, this book wrestles with the trauma of the individual losing their ability to express or to be creatively in a larger world that may not respect their personhood, their political sovereignty, their social context. And so the title poem that I read from today, it's the central poem of the book, and it's most of the book, but there are two other long poems on either side of it. It forms like a little bit of a triptych. And both of those poems are engaged with, in a time of crisis, climate crisis, political crisis. We now live, in the United States anyways, we lived in a democracy that had a civil society and civil norms, not a perfect society by any stretch, and certainly there were very vulnerable people within it that continued, but we now, but I will say this, and I do believe this, that sense of a civil society is unraveling, and we're heading into a society that now has like political violence is the norm. I mean, when, you know what I mean? Like, this is something that has existed around the world and in certain places, including democracies, but it feels newish here. And I was really engaged with, and in other places too, I write about the Palestinian. The first poem in the book is about the Palestinian sprinter Mohammed Al-Khatib, who was trying to qualify for the Rio Olympics at the time, and sort of the constraints that he was under. So I was very much engaged with this question of the individual against this huge backdrop. And so Sheila and her powers of expression, and then her inability to access that anymore. I mean, that became part of this large epic, I guess it is an epic engagement. And what do you do after? How do you go on? What do you do next? So I think those are the questions that I was wrestling with, and that I continue to wrestle with even now.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
Let's see. There was a question earlier, but here we are, from Undil Gosain, a dear friend, and he says, I've been a huge fanboy of Miss Chandra since the late 90s, so it's a thrill to witness Kazim's celebration of her voice. Thinking back, I think there was something uniquely diasporic about her sound that resonated so deeply with me. There's a kind of reinvention of tradition in her work, through which I made this visceral connection. I'm wondering if both Kazim and Sheila, or if Kazim can speak to your engagement of cultural hybridity, not merely repeating tradition, but through your openness, creating new melodies, both sonic and through text.
Yes, that's what it is. It is moving forward, and cultural expression has always done that. There has always been a trajectory, but I think oftentimes it's frozen in place with political purpose. I'm sorry to be so practical about it, but I really believe that's true. I mean, if you want to take the form of the ghazal, for example, as it developed in the Arab-speaking world, and then traveled into Farsi, and then traveled into Urdu. So it basically traveled on the Silk Road over centuries from language to language. It was always a fluid form. The reason why people talk about, like, and they will talk about it, Google the phrase, the golden age of the ghazal, the golden age of the Urdu ghazal, and you'll hear about Delhi court society of the late 1900s. I mean, the reason it was frozen there is because the Mughal Empire had their court poets, and they had to promote, what their form of cultural expression was the most superior. It's the same thing with the sonnet when people say that Shakespeare is the height of the sonnet. I mean, there's a reason for that, And when people take those forms and bring them into the future, that's what the forms always did in ancient times. So when I think of the drone as what it existed then, and it had a spiritual weight attached to it in terms of as a devotional, to do an om as a spiritual practice, existed in ancient times. In Mahabalipuram, which is a city in South India in Tamil Nadu, where the Chola Empire around 600 or 700 AD or CE, as we say, was there. I went there, and they have all these sculptures and statues that are there that are really famous, like Arjun's penance and other ones. But they have this sort of like pavilion, and it's a stone pavilion, and it's got this arched top, and it's got these sort of dimples in the arches. And it's not that attractive, but what it's meant for is you go inside there and you om. And when you om, it resonates, and your entire body fills with this vibration, and you sort of quiver. There were spiritual purposes behind this. There were therapeutic medical purposes behind this. Like it was, the notion that sound was healing. So all of these things were known since ancient times. And I think when Sheila Chandra takes the drone and does what she does with it, and what the Ganges Orchestra pieces, and a Bone Crone drone album, and then the pure drones that you can find all these recordings. They took what that classical drone was and then used electronic music actually to bring it to the next level. But none of that's an innovation any more innovative than what was happening in 700 CE in Mahabalipuram with the construction of that thing. We've always innovated. The moments that we think of as the golden age or the kind of canonical moment of a form, that's always tied to whatever political institution at the time needed to, express cultural superiority over somebody else. There's nothing intrinsic to the art, in other words. Shakespeare's sonnets are not better than Ted Berrigan's.
I think we have time for one more question, I believe. And this question comes from David Milne, who asks, I listen to a lot of Sheila's music, but feel not nearly enough people know about her music. Do you listen to Sheila's music alone or with others? And do you have many other friends who appreciate Sheila's music?
Yeah, I think Sheila is, she's a legend. People who know her music, and it's, plenty of people in the yoga community and spiritual communities. And I humbly hope this book may build her audience. Pop music is pop music. Pop poetry is pop poetry, pop art is pop art. There's always the work that's being created that is more challenging, more difficult, more profound, reaches deeper. I think anybody in the world who will listen to, a piece of, Sheila singing is going to love it, When The Lord of the Rings came out and she sang on there, everybody was like, who is this person, So a lot of how art gets distributed and how art is promoted is around, who can sell the most of something, and somehow that makes it more valuable or more interesting. So that book of poetry that's selling 10,000 copies is like somehow intrinsically better than a book of poetry that sells 10, but anybody who reads poetry knows that that's not necessarily true. So I think it's just with any kind of art, it's important to promote what you love and to share what you love, and to, help artists make a living so they can keep doing what they're doing. And that's why I have just so much tremendous respect for what Sheila did after, which is, and now to this day, which is she mentors other artists and she helps people figure out how to have creative lives. And she spent a lot of time writing a book about habits for creative people. And then when the pandemic hit and we were all locked up, her answer was to release the book for free on the internet, because she was like, everybody's locked up now, and so maybe everybody needs this so you can do your creative work. It's just a tremendous act of generosity in terms of the work is for the art itself, and yet there's this practical, I just want to add this one thing, because I loved how practical, Sheila, if you're still listening, I love how practical you were, where I'm talking about like very woo-woo things, and then you talk about the biology, you know, the anatomy of the vocal cords and what they do and how they do it. And I think that sort of transmits into what Sheila's doing now, which is people who live creative lives need to have good habits and they need to be able to make a living. And so she's helping people do that, you know? So I think for everybody who's on this call, like the artists in your life deserve support. The arts institutions that are out there deserve support. Asian American Writers Workshop, hello, thank you so much for hosting us, deserve support. I think it's just really, really important to realize that whatever's being promoted on the big airwaves, it's not all there is. There's so much more.
I was looking for the like clappy emoji here, but I'm like, you know, really, you know, want to emphasize your answer there. We have actually one last question, and then we'll close from our beloved Jan Ekta.
Oh.
Yeah. And she asks, as an author, how does being in conversations with those whose work resonates with you deepen your work? What influences do you sense to be at play?
I mean, it's tremendously important to me. Art has always been a conversation, whether it's painting. I mean, Agnes Martin appears in this book a lot. I didn't read those sections, but she's in there quite a bit. Sheila's music, the writing of other artists. I'm at the moment really engaged with these 4 South Asian women, all women of South Asian descent. Sheila Chandra, of course, as inspiring this book. The poet Mina Alexander, who is a dear friend and mentor who passed away in 2018 and whose latest book I've just published through the press that I work with, Nightboat Books. Then there's Ananda Devi, who's a Mauritian poet and novelist who lives in France, whose book of poems I just translated from French, and we're publishing it in India. We couldn't find a US publisher for it, so if you're interested, send me a note. And then finally, there is an Indian poet. I want to talk to you about her. I want to mention her name to you. Her name is Shrila Ray. Shrila, S-H-R-E-E-L-A, Ray. She died in 1994. She moved to the States in 1960 for college. She published in Poetry Magazine as early as 1966. She published her first and only book of poetry in 1977. And then she didn't publish again for 17 years. And then she died prematurely at age 52. So we are right now, I'm working with a guy named Rohan Chatri, and we're editing her selected poems and letters, and it's going to be out in the spring. So I just feel like writing as a writer, it's always a conversation with other writers and artists, and the work that needs to be done to support the work of other people it's just really important as a teacher, as an editor, as a translator, as a publisher. I always want to, you know, I want to be a part of that group. I want to be a part of that club of Sheila, Mina, Shrila, and Ananda. You know, I'll be okay if we can all hang out one day together in a room. I mean, Mina's and Shrila are not in the world anymore, but, you know, they'll still be with us in spirit.
Wow, thank you. And thank you for such a wonderful conversation, Sheila and Kazim. And thank you for all of your questions, you folks who are watching.
Thank you both so much. I just want to very quickly close. I want to ask for a round of virtual applause in the chat for Kazim, Rajiv, and Sheila, who I believe is still on the call as well. Thank you all for such just a beautiful, inspiring, and moving evening. We're so grateful to have you here at the Asian American Writers Workshop in our virtual space. Thank you again. There are links in the chat, although with the applause coming in, you may need to scroll up a little bit, but there are links to purchase the books. There are links to Kazim, Rajiv's, and Sheila's social media handles. We hope that you will join the workshop again later this year on December 1st. We have another program. There's details on our website at aaw.org/events. Thank you to our friends at Books Are Magic for providing a link and being our virtual booksellers for this evening. And yeah, thank you all again. This was really so special. We're very, very grateful. Have a good night. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you.